Hey, hey, hey! Welcome to my cozy corner of the internet. This is Nephilim VA bringing you the 8th and final chapter of our Painted Stages Fall Apart by Scenes, which is written by Silverheart SP on AO3. The end is nigh. Will we all end up crying, or is there some comfort to warm us before the curtains close? We can't find out until after the trigger warnings of this emotional rollercoaster of a wump that is this fanfiction. This fanfiction is for general audiences with themes of fluff and angst, near-death experiences, and canon-typical violence. Also beware of slight manga spoilers. If that isn't your style, then I recommend a real James Bond type, which is written by Hybrid Empress on AO3. It can be found on my channel! Brace yourselves, everybody! Now I implore you to sit back and relax whilst I read to you. Chapter 8. We can't see the future through the past. Sounds filtered through the void. Who is he? He needs more. Fiend. Stood. Quick! Kilograms, now! Stabilizing, but yet monitor. Wake. He need sleep. Someone get her. Quick. Hurry. A cold finger pressed to his forehead. Fingers, long and bony, were running through his hair. That was the first sensation Izuku registered. He felt fuzzy, numb. Thoughts and sensations came to him sluggishly, and he couldn't quite grasp them. His whole body was one steady feeling of nothingness, and distantly, he thought that was a bit unusual. A steady rhythmic beeping registered in his hearing. He vaguely thought there should be pain, but there was nothing. What had happened? The hand carding through his hair felt nice, soft, caring. He liked it. It felt like he could lie here forever, nothing except him and the pleasant tingling it brought him. It took some effort, but he managed to lean into it slightly as his first movement. His body didn't seem to want to listen to him, remaining heavy. To his disappointment, the hand stopped abruptly. A slight gasp rang out from somewhere to his left. Izuku? A hoarse, tired voice whispered. My boy, are you awake? Somewhere in the depths of his mind, Izuku recognized the voice. His head lolled against his pillow, and the heaviness in his arms subsided for a second as he flared it out. It moved, feeling for the owner of the voice, finding nothing in the air. A warm hand caught his. My boy, the voice repeated, now closer. A warm, pleasant feeling filled Izuku at the kind voice, making him feel floaty and heavy at the same time. Somehow. Oh my? He slurred hoarsely. God, his throat was dry. A rough pain filled it as he spoke, and coughed involuntarily. This brought attention to a horrible metallic taste in his mouth. There was shuffling nearby. The hand reluctantly let go to Izuku's disappointment. Izuku heard a chair creak, and some footsteps followed by clinking sounds. More footsteps, then the chair creaking again. Yes, it's me, my boy, All Might whispered, taking Izuku's hand back, and Izuku was filled with a strange, floaty sort of peace and security. Everything was going to be fine. All Might was here. Here, some ice chips for your throat, continued All Might, and he gently pressed something cold into the other hand. A plastic cup, Izuku thought distantly. Izuku weakly lifted the cup to his lips, an automatic action. A chip fell onto his tongue, cold and delightful. His mouth immediately felt better as it melted, cracking through the dryness and numbing the disgusting taste. He wasted no time in finishing the rest of them, and soon his throat felt much fresher, not any more as if he had been gargling gravel. Wanting to see his mentor, Izuku managed to crack open his eyes. Bright, blaring, artificial lights swam in his vision, and he had to quickly snap them shut again. He let out a weak groan. "Shh, my boy, take your time," said All Might softly. The hand he had woken up to returned to his hair, and Izuku sunk a bit lower in the bedsheets. He let out a content huff as the silence washed back over, the only sensation being the gentle fingers through his hair. Okay, he was definitely hopped up on something right now, that was for sure. Something very pleasant, giving him this detached floatiness and numbness spread throughout his body. And he was in a bed. Paired with the presence of All Might and the ice chips and the bright lights, he managed to struggle through the fog to the conclusion that he was in a hospital. Now kind of more aware of the situation, he decided to try opening his eyes again. This time, he tilted his head to the side before he cracked them open. All Might's face appeared in his line of sight, blurry and wavering. Izuku blinked, clearing up his vision a bit. All Might's sunken eyes bore into him, filled with concern. "What?" Izuku began weakly, his throat still a bit dry. What happened?" he managed, gazing into All Might's wide eyes. "You don't remember?" asked All Might, frowning in worry. Izuku closed his eyes again, trying to think. What was the last thing he remembered? He had woken up in the morning, he had eaten breakfast, worked out. Oh yes, he had been excited for his trip to the museum. He remembered the awkward train ride, the All Might exhibit. Bakugo had been with him. Bakugo. He remembered. Excruciating pain, a thick darkness, booms of thunder and muttered curses, and the sound of rocks moving. Izuku's eyes snapped open, and he heard the steady beeping nearby speed up. Ka-chan, he breathed, staring at All Might worriedly. Is he okay?" He coughed again, though this time less harshly. "Young Bakugo is fine, my boy," assured All Might, squeezing his hand. "He was admitted here with you, a bit dehydrated, but otherwise nothing that couldn't be fixed with the healing quirks of the doctors." He felt a bit of relief at that, but his heart still pounded against his ribcage. He and Bakugo hadn't been the only ones at the museum. He tried, his voice still gravelly. What about the others?" All Might squeezed his hand again. "All currently fine and recovering, my boy. Out of everyone there, it was you who was the worst off, young Midoriya," All Might said quietly. "Oh," breathed Izuku. He remembered now. The rebar that had been sticking out of his side. It had been abysmally painful and drawn out, lying there, helpless. He was very glad to hear there had been no worse injuries than that. Absently, he focused his attention onto where he remembered the burning source of all his pain had been, his side. But there was nothing except a heady numbness, because it had been healed or because he was probably stuffed full of painkillers. He didn't know. He was just so glad it was gone. His attention shifted, and his eyes sleepily slid over the face of his mentor. He looked more gaunt than usual, and the shadows lining his face were more pronounced. He looked exhausted. Guilt hit him, but it was overwhelmed by the soothing relief from earlier. His friends were okay, and he was the only one who had gotten really hurt. He was so glad his friends hadn't had to suffer. Sorry, All Might, said Izuku. He really did feel bad about making him worry, even though he was glad it had been him and not one of his friends.
It's all right, my boy,
sighed All Might.
I'm just so very grateful that you're all right now.
In a surprisingly tender gesture, All Might raised the hand he was grasping and rested his forehead against it. Overwhelmed with everything, Izuku felt himself begin to tear up. He blinked rapidly as his throat tightened. He would not cry in front of All Might. Not that he hadn't before, but this was different. A few tears slipped out anyway, and he made a pathetic-sounding whimper.
Oh, my boy,
said All Might, before gently lowering his hand. All Might leaned over him, and careful to avoid his injuries, pulled Izuku into a hug. Izuku's chin rested on All Might's bony shoulder, and he could feel All Might's skinny arms wrapped around his back and shoulders. His mentor's embrace was so warm and he felt so safe.
You must know, my boy,
said All Might quietly, his hand making small ministrations on Izuku's back. Izuku breathed in deeply.
We were so close to losing you there. You must know. I love you, my boy. I don't know what I would have done if...
All Might cut off into a choked noise. If Izuku had been more in his right mind, maybe he would have been blushing furiously, but for now, he didn't stand a chance. The rest of his tears spilled out, dampening All Might's baggy suit jacket and hitching his breath. He choked on a sob, his throat still not completely soothed, and buried his face into All Might's shoulder. I love you too, All Might. He hiccuped into the soft fabric. He trembled, overwhelmed. All Might gently laid a hand on the back of his head and pulled him closer, resting his chin in Izuku's hair.
It's all right, my boy, he soothed. You and your friends are all right. You're all right.
All Might used his other hand to begin rubbing soothing circles into Izuku's back, and Izuku melted into it. They sat there for an indeterminable amount of time, Izuku crying softly and All Might murmuring soothing nothings into his hair. Izuku breathed, trying to gather himself. Eventually, Izuku let out one last sniffle and pulled away. All Might lowered his hands, leaning back into his seat.
Your mother is here,
said All Might as Izuku wiped at his eyes.
She just had to return to your apartment briefly in order to take a shower. She'll be back soon, probably.
Izuku nodded, breaking into a wobbly smile. He was glad his mother was here. He wanted to see her after this terrible, frightening experience.
Aizawa and your classmates will want to see you too,
All Might continued.
Everyone was very worried, my boy,
he emphasized, giving a watery smile. The guilt rushed back. He couldn't imagine how much stress he had caused everyone and his mother. He wanted to see her, but she would be dying of worry.
Now, All Might said, back to business. I'll call the nurse to say you're awake, shall I?
Izuku, ever the quirk enthusiast, had asked the nurse exactly how he'd been healed. Nobody had been able to use a pure healing quirk on him, since those often had repercussions on the recipient. He had been too injured for that. A quirk like Recovery Girl's would have killed him. Apparently, he had gone into surgery, and the surgeon had a stasis quirk similar to the pro-hero Rocklock's. he had used it on Izuku to keep his body locked into the state it was at to prevent him from worsening during the operation. After the surgery, a nurse had used a quirk that sped up blood clotting without draining stamina to boost the healing of the wound, and another had used one which acted as a painkiller but didn't actually enter his blood, allowing them to give him more drugs and antibiotics than they otherwise would have been able to. Izuku itched to learn more. His mind was already racing with possible alternative applications for all of those. He asked the nurse if she would be able to organize for the doctors to talk to him. She had laughed in surprise and said she'd do her best. After that, it had been constant monitoring and fussing. His nurse's quirk increased his metabolism. She used it on him to force him to eat more and absorb more of the nutrients he needed to heal faster. His mother had visited him soon after All Might had predicted she would. She had cried when she saw him, and Izuku cried as well, and All Might had slipped out to give them some privacy. She had held him closely and told him she had lost several years of her life from the stress. After that, it was late. His friends and teacher would visit him in the morning, All Might said. They were still helping with the rest of the rescue efforts for the remainder of the day. Izuku slept soundly, his sleep uninterrupted because of the drugs giving him numbness. The darkness was different to the darkness in the small cave, less crushing, less absolute. Izuku woke up slowly the next morning, his nurse leaning over him with a tray of food. She used her quirk on him again, and he ate the whole thing, despite not having much of an appetite. It was late morning when a knock came to his door. Izuku looked up from where he had been absently surfing the TV. He thought he might know who it was. "Come in?" he said unsuredly, just in case he was wrong. The door burst open. He hadn't been wrong. In front of him were 4 of his classmates, Uraraka, Jiro, Todoroki, and Tsuyu. They all seemed frantic and zeroed in on his form with intensity. "Deku!" yelled Uraraka, rushing towards his bedside. Izuku could see her eyes were glossed over and shining. He reddened slightly and looked away, embarrassed to have caused her concern. The other 3 followed closely behind her. All of their expressions were a mix between trepidation and relief, and Izuku sat up, quickly switching off the TV. Hi, guys," he said nervously, unable to meet any of their eyes. "Deku!" wailed Uraraka softly. She grabbed one of his hands that had been fiddling with the bedsheet. "We were so worried. Don't you dare ever scare us like that again!" Todoroki next to her nodded. "Yes," he said seriously, "that was incredibly frightening, Midoriya," he emphasized, and his eyes bored into Izuku's. Izuku didn't dare look away. Doing so would feel like the coward's way out. Don't do it again. The rest of them expressed a similar sentiment. Jiro detailed how she hadn't thought he would make it when Aizawa emerged from the tunnel with him, and how glad she was that he was okay. Tsuyu detailed the tenseness of the dorms and the determination to find him, how she and the others had been looking for him and Bakugo most of all, despite their job being any survivors. He was so grateful for his friends. He teared up again as they spoke. When he started crying, reassuring them he was fine, thanking them for caring, he was met with hugging and protests. How could they ever not care for him? How worried they had been for him. How would their class have gone on without him? The 4 of them stayed for their full hour of visiting time, giving him updates on the others, telling him about class and all the work they missed. He heard stories of the rescue mission they had gone on. He was incredibly embarrassed to have been a victim, but was reassured that he didn't miss much. They comforted him, saying there was bound to be another rescue mission under similar circumstances that they would get to help with during his time at UA. He laughed and the rest of the visit was spent light-heartedly. After they had been practically dragged out by the nurses promising to visit tomorrow, his next visitor was his homeroom teacher. It was the afternoon at this point, and Izuku had a tray of food in front of him that he was eating slowly. He had sort of gotten used to eating so much despite feeling kinda sick. All thanks to his nurse and her quirk. The knock that came on his door was much calmer and more rhythmic, and Izuku immediately knew who it was. "Enter," he muffled, his mouth still full of food. He swallowed as the door creaked open, revealing the deadpan face of Mr. Aizawa. "Problem child," he greeted. Izuku grinned sheepishly. "Next time, finish eating before you speak," he chastised, stepping into the room. Sorry, Izuku said, reddening. He pointedly put down his chopsticks back onto his tray. Aizawa approached his bed, hesitating a moment before sitting down in a plastic chair situated next to it. "How are you feeling, Midoriya?" asked Aizawa. Okay, I guess," replied Izuku, internally gauging if that was true, which it was. He had been anticipating his meeting with Aizawa with an undertone of dread and nervousness. "I'm very glad to hear that, Midoriya," said Aizawa, glancing at where Midoriya's healing wound was concealed under the bedsheets. "That was quite the injury, problem child." Izuku reddened and ducked his head in embarrassment. The others had told him of what his teacher had done, how Aizawa had gone after him. Aizawa had pulled him off the rebar, and then, when he had come out of the tunnel, Izuku was kind of in awe. Without this man sitting in front of him, he probably wouldn't be here right now. He quickly glanced back at Aizawa's unreadable face. I know what happened, sir," stammered Izuku, shyly looking away from his teacher. He fumbled with his sheets, his nightgown, his tray. He looked around the room, anywhere but at Aizawa's stoic face, too ashamed, perhaps, to face him. Izuku finally settled on staring at his lap. I just... He tried awkwardly. He closed his eyes. Okay, deep breath. It was very important that he said this to his teacher, so Aizawa knew he was grateful. "Sir, thank you," said Izuku, looking up at his teacher. For the second time that day, his eyes filled with tears as he took in the man's ragged, exhausted face. "For what?" asked Aizawa tiredly. "You should know by now, problem child. There was no possible scenario in which I would have left you, or your friends, on your own." The tears spilled over, and Izuku hid his face in his hands. His teacher sat with him, a silent and steady presence as Izuku shook. Once he had calmed down and desperately stammered out more teary gratitudes, Aizawa took the time to gently probe Izuku on his mental and physical health. How he was feeling mentally. Was he getting nightmares? Would he need therapy? It was a traumatizing experience, after all. Izuku thought about it, but ultimately decided he was too tired to say anything on the matter right now. Maybe he would need a few sessions with Hound Dog back at school, or maybe he wouldn't. He had been in arguably worse situations, after all. And he had been with Bakugo the whole time. That helped a lot. He would be able to tell once everything had calmed down and he had a moment to think in peace. Aizawa conceded, and said to come to him when he knew for sure. Afterwards, his teacher provided him with an update on Ida, Yaoyorozu, Kirishima, Sato, and Bakugo. All of them were doing well, and the first 4 had already been discharged. They would want to visit him next, most likely. Izuku had smiled at that, looking forward to it. Aizawa was quick to rectify that by reminding him that there was still classwork waiting for him when he got discharged. "Yes, sir," conceded Izuku miserably, and Aizawa gave a fond smile. His teacher left soon after to check on Bakugo, who was set to be discharged later that day apparently. Izuku wondered at that. He really, really hoped Bakugo hadn't been hurt too badly, especially since Izuku had been so helpless. True to Aizawa's word, he barely got a break before there was another knock at his door. This time, he had nothing in his mouth as he told the guest to enter. Izuku's heart clenched, and he teared up, again, with happiness when he saw the friends he had been so worried about standing at his door, as good as new. "Midoriya!" exclaimed Ida, who was standing at the front of the group. He charged over to Izuku's hospital bed, and the other three followed. Izuku not so subtly examined his friends as they approached. He had been told they were fine, but he needed to see for himself, to make sure. Ida had one of his arms in a cast, but other than that, he seemed uninjured and in good spirits. Sato came hobbling in on crutches, but gave Izuku a bright smile, which Izuku replicated with a wobbly one. Yaoyorozu had some bandages wrapped around her head, but no other obvious injuries. A slight smile tugged at her lips, and she followed the more boisterous Ida shyly. Kirishima trailed behind the group, the only one with no obvious injuries. He seemed completely fine and gave Izuku a sharp-toothed grin. Hey, Ida, greeted Izuku, a warm happiness filling him and putting him at ease. It was one thing to be told they were alright, but another to see it. "I am incredibly relieved to see you are alright," said Ida, stopping at the edge of Izuku's bed. The others followed, surrounding the bed and Izuku. "Yeah, dude," agreed Sato, settling at the end of Izuku's bed with his crutches. "You too," sighed Izuku, looking up at them. "I'm so happy to see you guys." "And us you, Midoriya," accentuated Ida. He chopped through the air with his good arm in a grand gesture, and Izuku couldn't stop himself from smiling at the familiarity. "Yeah, man," exclaimed Kirishima. "That was freaking insane. We were so glad to hear you got out of it all right." Yeah. I was really glad to hear all of you got out of it all right too," said Izuku, looking at all of them. Kirishima grinned in response and gently nudged Izuku's shoulder. "I must say," piped up Yaoyorozu, "I am disappointed that we didn't get to see much of the exhibition before it was destroyed." Izuku let out a startled laugh, echoed by the others. He kind of agreed, though. He really had been excited for that exhibition. "So what happened, man?" asked Sato, leaning in. "We all got trapped in the same area. Were you and Bakugo together? We heard you got injured pretty bad. We visited Bakugo just before, but he wouldn't say anything." Izuku awkwardly explained how he and Bakugo had been in the basement when the bombs had gone off. They were buried so far down that no water had leaked in from the storm. Through some miraculous stroke of luck, they hadn't been crushed by rubble, instead being trapped in a small pocket of space with limited air. He explained that though they had been lucky not to get completely trapped, he had been impaled by a rebar. Yaoyorozu gasped while Sato's eyes widened. "Oh, dude!" exclaimed Kirishima, his eyes also widening. "Holy crap! Are you okay?" "Yes, Midoriya!" said Ida in alarm. "That sounds incredibly concerning! Are you alright now?" Izuku chuckled sheepishly. "Yeah, guys, don't worry." His friends continued to express their concerns, but Izuku explained how the doctors had fixed him up very well and were monitoring him closely and making sure he was recovering correctly. This did ease them somewhat, and Izuku was curious too. How exactly had they fared? "I kept my quirk on the whole time," exclaimed Kirishima. "That's why I didn't break anything or something," he said, holding up a hardened hand. "Yes," lamented Yaoyorozu. "I must admit I didn't have much room to use my own quirk, and I was quite out of it from a severe concussion I had. I wish I had been able to do more."
Don't worry, Yaoyorozu, I was pretty useless too, sighed Sato. I didn't have any sugar on me to help me break out. It sucked. Yes, I too wish I could have done more, agreed Ida. I was unable to move my legs enough to kick any rocks out of the way. The five of them talked for the entire hour Azuku was allowed visitors. They talked about what they had all respectively seen in the exhibition. The others wanted to hear about All Might's section since they hadn't had a chance to see it, and Azuku was dying to hear about anything he could to do with the rest of it. He was so disappointed that it was all destroyed. They kept chatting, and Azuku discovered that once they left, they were going back to the dorms. They had been discharged a day ago, and hadn't yet fully settled back in. The rest of the class had been having an ongoing welcoming party, which would continue until Azuku could finally come back. Azuku smiled widely at this. It filled him with happiness, knowing he would be given a warm welcome when he returned. He was more eager than ever to go and join his friends. They left in a slow trickle, stalling as much as possible until the nurse came back to kick them out. Azuku was sad to see them go, and he waved them out with a promise to get better soon. He went to sleep later feeling happy and floaty. He had seen his friends, he had seen his teacher, and he felt better. The drugs he was on ensured he felt no pain in his side. He still had another few days in hospital, but he knew they would get easier and easier. When Azuku woke up next, he was groggy. The nurses had recently given him his next round of painkillers through his IV, so he wasn't feeling much of anything. His head felt funny and clogged. He let out a groan to himself. He wondered when his nurse would be by with breakfast or dinner. He wondered what time it was. You finally awake, Deku? Azuku started. His eyes flew open and he lifted his head, turning to the visitor's seat. He blinked a few times to clear his eyes. Slumped in the plastic chair was Bakugo, sprawled out and staring at the floor. Oh, morning, Ka-chan, yawned Azuku. That's right, Bakugo had been discharged yesterday. Or was it earlier today? Bakugo didn't reply, still staring at the floor. Izuku tilted his head back onto the pillow and closed his eyes. Maybe he could get a bit more rest. Deku! Came Bakugo's voice. Izuku opened his eyes again. Yeah? Asked Izuku. Oh. Wait. Suddenly much more awake, Izuku scrambled to sit up in bed. He whipped around to look at Bakugo in surprise. Ka-chan! He squeaked, his eyes wide. Izuku took a moment to look his friend over. Bakugo at first glance seemed fine, but Izuku had known the other boy his entire life. There were certain things that were off. His hair was matted and greasy, as opposed to its usual uncanny explosive appearance. He seemed paler than normal, and when he looked up, there were dark shadows under his eyes. Izuku was instantly filled with concern. If he thought really hard, he thought he remembered Bakugo mentioning at some point during the time they were trapped that he wasn't injured. But if he stayed in the hospital for a few days... Ka-chan? Are you okay? Asked Izuku worriedly. Bakugo shifted and Izuku caught a better view of his arms. One of them had a cast over the wrist and hand. Izuku took in a sharp breath. You're hurt! He exclaimed in worry. It's not that bad, shitty nerd, said Bakugo holding up his arm. Just a fucking lame broken wrist. The doctor said that in a few days I'll be able to get it fixed by that stupid hag, so... Oh, that's great! Began Izuku, glad to hear that Bakugo was at least recovering well, even if he had lied about being fine. He thought for another split second about what Bakugo had said, then frowned. Don't call recovery girl a hag, Ka-chan. Bakugo snorted. Whatever, he dismissed, now leaning back in his chair. They lapsed into silence. Izuku relished in it. There had been a time in his life where there would have been no chance of Bakugo coming to see him if he was in hospital. He was so happy they seemed to have moved past that now.
Deku, said Bakugo slowly after a few minutes of silence. How much do you remember from when you were fucking out of it in there? Izuku frowned in confusion. What do you mean, Ka-chan? He asked, instantly attempting to rack his brain. Bakugo was silent again, and Izuku rapidly sorted through his memories of those dragged-out hours, when he was out of it. Izuku wasn't quite sure what that could possibly mean. He would argue he was out of it the whole time, but... You, said Bakugo, and he seemed to be struggling. Izuku looked at him in surprise. Bakugo didn't often struggle with anything. You thought it was a dream, I think. Fuck, said Bakugo. Izuku thought back. A dream. Oh, maybe he did know what Bakugo was referring to. Izuku's face smoothed out as he realized. Bakugo's voice softer and more unsure than it had ever been, his incoherent thoughts being answered somehow. Yeah, I think I remember that, said Izuku slowly, now staring at Bakugo. Bakugo shifted again. I just... he began, looking away. I mean it, okay? Don't forget it. Izuku kept staring. Slowly, a smile grew on his face and he nodded. Thanks, Ka-chan, said Izuku. He suddenly felt a lot lighter and floatier. It might have been the drugs, but Izuku didn't think so. They lapsed into silence again. Bakugo looked anywhere that wasn't Izuku. Izuku looked at Bakugo, the smile on his face turning giddy as the drugs in his system began to reclaim their effect. Deku, said Bakugo suddenly, just as Izuku was beginning to drift again. I'm glad you're not dead. Izuku jerked his head up and stared at Bakugo in shock. What? He began, but stopped quickly. Bakugo wasn't looking at him. Izuku took a moment to catch up with himself, then his face slowly broke into a smile. I think that's the nicest thing you've ever said to me, Ka-chan, he said, his voice breaking. His smile turned wobbly, and he could feel himself beginning to tear up. Again. Tss, grunted Bakugo. Don't fucking forget it, nerd! He finished gruffly, still looking away. Izuku sniffled as the first tears dropped down from his eyes onto his cheeks. Bakugo whipped his head up, and finally met Izuku's eyes at the sound. Hey! He barked, standing up out of the chair. Don't start crying, you fucking... I'm glad you're not dead too, Ka-chan, said Izuku wetly, wiping his eyes. Bakugo sat back down in his chair with a grumble. They would be okay. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate all the support you've given me. And that's a wrap, everyone. The end of our painted stages fall apart by scenes. And it ended with some wholesomeness. A massive thank you to Silverheart SP over on AO3 for writing this amazing fanfiction. You deserve all the hugs. All credits go to them. Happy Halloween and happy Samhain, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day filled with spookiness and fun. With that being said, I would highly appreciate it if you gave this video a like and you subscribe to the channel and you hit the notification bell to be notified of when I next upload. There is no pressure to do so though. Thank you for visiting my cozy corner of the internet. Keep growing my sunflowers. Mwah.